I was working the front desk at a hotel in Amsterdam when an American couple walked in looking completely exhausted. They had been wandering around for 2 hours trying to find us. The husband pulled out his phone and showed me the address they had been given. It was correct. The street name was right there on the building. So what was the problem? They had been looking for the street number. In America, buildings have numbers. Big visible numbers, sometimes even on the mailbox. In Amsterdam, like in many European cities, the numbers are small brass plates near the door. Sometimes they are painted. Sometimes they are just carved into the stone. This couple had walked past our hotel 6 times because they were expecting American-style house numbers. The wife actually said, "How is anyone supposed to find anything here?" If you notice details like that, the tiny cultural blind spots most travelers miss, you'll fit right in here. I break these down every week, so if this already has you thinking, make sure you're tuned in. I smiled and pointed at the small brass number right next to the door. She stared at it like I had just shown her a magic trick. But here is the thing. This happens all the time. Not just with house numbers. With everything. Americans travel with a very specific set of expectations. And when the world does not match those expectations, confusion follows. Sometimes it is funny. Sometimes it is frustrating. And sometimes it reveals something deeper about how we see the world. My coworker in the hotel was from Germany. She told me about an American guest who complained that the light switches did not work. The guest kept flipping them on and off, but nothing happened. Turns out, European hotel rooms often have a master switch by the door. You have to insert your room key card into a slot to activate the electricity. It saves energy. The guest had been trying to turn on lights for 10 minutes without putting the key card in the slot. When my coworker explained it, the guest said, "That is so complicated. Why not just use normal switches?" Normal switches, as if the American way is the default and everything else is a variation. Another guest asked where the ice machine was. We do not have ice machines in most European hotels. Ice is not a thing people need in large quantities here. The guest looked genuinely confused. He said, "How do you keep your drinks cold?" We explained that drinks come cold from the fridge. He shook his head and muttered, "This is going to be a long trip." These are not isolated incidents. They happen every single day. Americans arrive in other countries expecting things to work the way they do back home. And when they do not, the reaction is rarely curiosity. It is usually frustration, or disbelief, or the assumption that the foreign country is doing it wrong. So why does this happen? Why do Americans struggle so much outside their bubble? The answer is not simple. It is not about intelligence. It is not even about ignorance, really. It is about something much bigger. It is about living in a country so large and so isolated that the rest of the world feels theoretical. It is about growing up in a system that rarely requires you to think beyond your borders. And it is about the quiet belief that American ways are universal ways. Let me show you what I mean. I worked as a tour guide in Scotland for 3 summers. One of the most common questions I got was about distances. Americans would ask how far something was, and I would say, "About 15 kilometers." They would stare at me. Then they would pull out their phones and try to convert it. One guy actually said, "Can you just tell me in real measurements?" Real measurements. As if kilometers are fake. That's the kind of thinking I unpack here. How our assumptions shape what we call normal. Most people scroll past. But if you're the kind who actually wants to understand the logic behind cultures, this is your space. Here is what most Americans do not realize. The entire world uses the metric system. Every country except 3. The United States, Liberia, and Myanmar. That is it. Nearly 8 billion people use meters and kilograms. But Americans grow up learning feet and pounds. And they grow up believing that is normal. I had a family on one of my tours who wanted to hike to a nearby loch. I told them it was about 5 kilometers. The father asked how long that would take. I said maybe an hour at a relaxed pace. He frowned. He said 5 kilometers sounded like a lot. His wife agreed. I tried to explain that 5 kilometers is just over 3 miles. They still looked unsure. Eventually, they decided not to do the hike. Too far. Later that day, I overheard them talking. They had looked it up. 5 kilometers is 3.1 miles. They were annoyed. The father said, "Why did he make it sound so far?" I had not made it sound like anything. I had just used the measurement system that everyone in Scotland uses. But to them, kilometers felt foreign and intimidating. This happens with temperature too. I was chatting with an American tourist in Edinburgh. She asked what the weather would be like that week. I said it would be around 18 degrees. She looked horrified. She said, 18 degrees? That is freezing! I realized she thought I meant Fahrenheit. I explained it was Celsius. She had no idea what that meant in real terms. I told her 18 Celsius is about 64 Fahrenheit. She relaxed. Oh, that is nice. But here is the deeper issue. Most Americans do not just struggle with conversions. They struggle with the idea that their system is not universal. In school, they learn imperial measurements. They grow up with miles per hour and gallons and ounces. And because America is so big, they can travel thousands of miles without ever needing to convert anything. You can drive from Florida to Alaska and never see a kilometer sign. So when Americans go abroad, they expect the world to accommodate them. I have seen tourists get genuinely frustrated when signs are not in miles. One woman told me, "It is so inconvenient. How are visitors supposed to know how far things are?" I wanted to say, "You are the visitor. Maybe learn the system." But I just smiled. Another time, I was helping an American couple plan a road trip through the Highlands. They wanted to know how much petrol would cost. I told them it was about £1.50 per liter. The husband paused. He said, "Per liter? How much is that in gallons?" I did the math. About $6 per gallon at the time. He was shocked. He said gas was way cheaper in America. I explained that fuel costs vary by country. Taxes are higher in Europe. Public transport is better. People drive less. He was not interested in reasons. He just kept saying how expensive everything was. But the funniest moment was with speed limits. I was in a car with a group of tourists. The driver was American. We were on a country road. The speed limit sign said 60. He looked at it and said, "60? That is so slow." Then he started driving. Within 2 minutes, we were flying down the road. I realized he thought the sign meant 60 miles per hour. It meant 60 kilometers per hour. That is only about 37 miles per hour. He was going almost twice the speed limit. I told him to slow down. He looked confused. I explained the sign was in kilometers. He hit the brakes. He was embarrassed. But then he said, "Why do they not just put it in miles? Everyone knows miles." I did not have the heart to tell him that most of the world has no idea how long a mile is. This is the core problem. Americans grow up in a bubble where their system is the only system. They do not learn metric in any meaningful way. They do not need to. And because America is so influential, they assume the rest of the world will adjust to them, but it does not. And that is when the struggle begins. I remember one guest who wanted to buy hiking boots in Inverness. He asked for size 10. The shop assistant asked if he meant UK size or US size. He looked confused. He said, "Just size 10. The assistant explained that sizing varies by country. A US size 10 is a UK size 9. The guest was frustrated. He said, "Why can they not just make it the same everywhere?" The assistant smiled politely and found him the right size. But as he left, he muttered, "Everything here is so complicated." It is not complicated. It is just different. And difference is hard when you have never had to deal with it. The measurement struggle is not about math. It is about mindset. It is about growing up in a place where your way is the only way you ever need to know, and then stepping into a world where your way is the exception. I was bartending in Dublin when an American tourist asked me a question I will never forget. He said, "So is Ireland part of England?" I paused. I thought he was joking. He was not. I explained that Ireland is its own country, a completely separate nation. He looked surprised. He said, "But you all speak English, right?" I told him yes, but that does not make us part of England. He shrugged and said, "Huh, I always thought it was all the same thing." This was not an isolated incident. Americans often have big gaps in their geographic knowledge, not because they are not smart, but because American schools focus heavily on American geography. World maps are often small sections in textbooks, and because America is so large, many Americans never leave it, so the rest of the world feels distant and abstract. I had another customer who asked if he could take a day trip to Paris from Dublin. I told him no. Paris is in France. It is over 1,000 kilometers away. He was shocked. He said, "But it is all Europe, right? I thought everything was close." I explained that Europe is not a small place. It is a continent with dozens of countries. He seemed disappointed. He had thought he could just drive around and see everything in a week. This is a common American assumption, that Europe is tiny. They see it on a map next to the United States and think, "Oh, that is small." But they do not realize that Europe is nearly 4 million square miles. It is huge. You cannot just hop between countries like you are driving between states. One woman asked me how long it would take to drive to Rome from Dublin. I told her it would take at least 2 days of non-stop driving. Plus, you would need to take a ferry to get to mainland Europe. She was stunned. She said, "I thought we could do it in a few hours." I asked why she thought that. She said she had looked at a map on her phone and it did not look that far. Scale is a tricky thing. Americans are used to driving long distances. 5 hours in a car is normal for them. But they assume that because European countries are smaller than US states, distances must be shorter too. They do not account for different road systems, or speed limits, or the fact that crossing borders means dealing with different languages and currencies. Another time, a tourist asked me if people in Ireland speak Irish or English. I told him both. He looked confused. He said, "Wait, Irish is a real language?" I explained that yes, Irish is a Celtic language. It is taught in schools. It is on road signs. He had no idea. He thought Irish just meant people from Ireland who speak English with an accent. This is the geography gap. Americans often do not know basic facts about other countries. Not because they do not care, but because they are never required to learn. In school, they study US history, US geography, US government. World history is usually one semester, and it focuses on big events like World War II or ancient civilizations. Modern geography gets glossed over. I once had a conversation with a guest who thought Africa was a country. I gently corrected him. I said Africa is a continent with 54 countries. He was embarrassed. He said, "Yeah, I guess I knew that. I just do not think about it." And that is the key phrase. I just do not think about it. Because he never has to. Americans can live their entire lives without thinking about the rest of the world. They have everything they need at home. Entertainment, jobs, nature, cities, beaches, mountains. They do not need to leave. And because they do not leave, they do not learn. I had a tourist ask me if Dublin was in Northern Ireland or Southern Ireland. I explained that Dublin is in the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland is a separate region that is part of the United Kingdom. He had no idea there was a difference. He said, "I thought it was all just Ireland." I spent 10 minutes explaining the history, the partition, the Troubles, the Good Friday Agreement. He listened politely, but I could tell it was a lot of new information. Another guest asked me what language they speak in London. I said English. He nodded. Then he asked what language they speak in Scotland. I said English, with some Scots and Gaelic in certain areas. He looked confused. He said, "But I thought British people all spoke the same." I explained that Britain is made up of England, Scotland, and Wales. Different regions, different cultures, different histories. He seemed overwhelmed. This is not about mocking anyone. It is about understanding why these gaps exist. American education is very inward-focused. Students learn their own history in extreme detail. They can name all 50 states. They know the capitals. They study the Civil War, the Constitution, westward expansion, but they rarely study other countries with the same depth. Compare that to Europe. Kids in Ireland learn Irish history, European history, and world history. They learn multiple languages. They study geography in detail. They grow up knowing where countries are, what languages are spoken, what currencies are used. Because they have to. Europe is small and interconnected. You cannot ignore your neighbors, but America is isolated. Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, and 2 oceans on either side. There is no need to think about the rest of the world. So most Americans do not. And when they finally travel abroad, they realize how much they do not know. One guest told me he wished he had paid more attention in school. He said, "I feel so lost here. I do not know anything about this place." I told him it is never too late to learn. He smiled and said, "Yeah, but it would have been easier if someone had taught me." That is the real issue. Not that Americans cannot learn, but that they were never taught to look beyond their borders. I was working at a restaurant in Paris when an American family sat down. They were loud. Not rude, just loud. They were talking and laughing and waving at the server. In France, this is unusual. French diners are generally quiet. They speak in low voices. Restaurants are treated as calm, respectful spaces. The server came over. The father immediately started ordering. He did not say hello. He did not wait for the server to greet them. He just launched into his order. The server looked uncomfortable. In France, you are supposed to greet the staff first. A simple bonjour is expected. It is considered polite. Skipping it feels rude. The server took the order without comment. But I could see the shift in his attitude. He was less warm, less helpful. The family did not notice. They kept talking loudly. They kept snapping their fingers to get his attention. At one point, the father actually whistled. The server's face tightened. Whistling at staff is incredibly disrespectful in France. When the meal ended, the family left a 20% tip. In America, that is standard. In France, it is excessive. Tips are usually just a few euros. Service is included in the bill. The server looked at the cash on the table and seemed confused. The family left feeling good about themselves. They thought they had been generous. They had no idea they had violated multiple cultural norms. This is the etiquette confusion. Every country has its own unwritten rules, and Americans often do not know them. Not because they are rude people, but because they assume etiquette is universal. They think being polite in America means being polite everywhere, but it does not. Had a friend who worked at a restaurant in Tokyo. She told me about an American couple who got frustrated because the server was not checking on them. In America, servers check in constantly. How is everything? Can I get you anything else? It is part of the dining experience. In Japan, it is the opposite. Servers leave you alone unless you call them. It is considered respectful to let diners eat in peace. The couple kept trying to make eye contact with the server. They kept looking around like they were being ignored. Eventually, the husband got up and went to find someone. My friend explained the custom. The couple was surprised. They said, "We thought the service was bad." It was not bad. It was just different. Another example. I was on a train in Germany. An American tourist was talking on his phone, loudly. He was having a full business conversation. Everyone in the train car was staring at him. In Germany, trains are quiet spaces. People read, work, or sit in silence. Talking loudly on the phone is considered inconsiderate. The man did not notice. He kept talking. Finally, an older German woman leaned over and said, "Excuse me, could you please lower your voice?" The American looked shocked. He said, "I am just on the phone." The woman did not argue. She just went back to her book. But the man was clearly offended. He told his friend on the phone, "People here are so uptight." He did not realize he was the problem. In America, talking on the phone in public is normal. No one would say anything. But in Germany, it is different. Public spaces have different expectations. I also saw this with shoes. I was visiting a friend in Sweden. An American guest came over and walked right into the house with his shoes on. My friend's family looked uncomfortable. In Sweden, You always take your shoes off when entering someone's home. Always. It is basic etiquette. But in many parts of America, it is optional. Some homes require it. Some do not. The guest did not realize his mistake until my friend politely asked him to remove his shoes. He was embarrassed. He said, "Oh, sorry. I did not know." My friend's mother smiled and said it was fine. But I could tell she was bothered. These moments add up. Americans travel with American etiquette. They do not research local customs. They assume what is polite at home is polite everywhere. And when locals react negatively, Americans often feel attacked. I remember a conversation with a tourist in Italy. She was frustrated because shopkeepers were not friendly. She said, "Everyone is so cold here. In America, people smile and chat." I explained that in Italy, shopkeepers are polite but reserved. They are not expected to make small talk with every customer. That does not mean they are unfriendly. It just means the culture is different. She did not seem convinced. She said, "I just think people should be nicer." But nice is subjective. What feels nice in one culture might feel fake in another. Another issue is personal space. Americans are used to a certain amount of distance. In places like India or Brazil, people stand closer. I saw an American woman in Mumbai who kept stepping back during conversations. She was uncomfortable with how close people were standing. But in India, that closeness is normal. It is not invasive. It is just how people interact. The woman complained to her husband. She said, "Everyone is in my space." Her husband shrugged. He said, "I guess that is just how it is here." She did not adjust. She spent the whole trip feeling uncomfortable. This is the etiquette trap. Americans expect the world to match their social norms. When it does not, they feel like something is wrong. They do not realize that etiquette is cultural, not universal. And because they do not research or adapt, they end up frustrated. Or worse, they come across as rude without meaning to. The truth is, every culture has its own logic, its own rules, and those rules make sense within that culture. But Americans rarely take the time to learn them. They just assume their way is the right way, and then they wonder why they struggle. I was back at the hotel in Amsterdam. Same front desk, different day. An American guest came down from his room. He looked annoyed. He said the shower was broken. I asked what was wrong. He said, "The water will not stay warm. It keeps going cold after a few minutes." I went up to check. The shower was fine, but he had been standing under it for 15 minutes. In many European buildings, hot water is limited. Tanks are smaller. Energy is expensive. Showers are meant to be quick. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Not long, luxurious American showers. I explained this to him. He was stunned. He said, "So I cannot take a normal shower?" I told him he could, but he would need to be faster. He shook his head. He said, "This is ridiculous. How do people live like this?" And that is the question. Is it not? How do people live like this? As if living differently is the same as living worse. That is the real reason Americans struggle outside their bubble. It is not about intelligence. It is not about being bad people. It is about perspective. Americans grow up in a country that has everything. A country so large and so powerful that it sets its own rules. A country where you never have to compromise or adapt because the American way is always available. So when Americans travel, they expect the world to bend to them. They expect ice machines and big house numbers and familiar measurements. They expect smiles and small talk and long, hot showers. And when those things are not there, they feel like something is missing. But nothing is missing. The world is just different. And different is not wrong. I have seen Americans who get this, who travel with curiosity instead of expectation, who ask questions instead of making complaints, who laugh at their own confusion instead of blaming the locals. Those people have amazing trips. They learn, they grow, they come back changed. But I have also seen Americans who never adjust, who spend their entire trip frustrated, who compare everything to home and find it lacking, who leave thinking the rest of the world is inconvenient or backward or difficult. The truth is, the world is not hard to navigate. It just requires a willingness to adapt, to learn, to accept that your way is not the only way. Americans struggle outside their bubble because the bubble is so comfortable. It has insulated them so well that they do not even realize it is a bubble. They think it is just reality. But step outside, and reality looks very different. I had one guest tell me something I have never forgotten. He was an older man, traveling alone. He said, "You know, I spent 50 years thinking America had it all figured out. Then I came here and realized we are just one way of doing things. Not the best way, not the only way, just one way," he smiled. He said, "I wish I had learned that sooner." That's the kind of shift I try to spark every week. Seeing the world not as strange, but as connected. If that's the lens you want to keep refining, you already know where to stay tuned. Me too. And trust me, these stories never stop coming.